I'm Susan Blackmore, author of The Meme Machine and Conversations on Consciousness. You're listening to WBAI New York, your peace and justice radio, and I believe in equal time for free thought.
So, Susan, let's help the audience get to know you a bit and your background. You used to be a parapsychologist. Why did you give that up?
I gave it up because of the evidence, basically. I got into parapsychology because after experiences of my own, I believed in clairvoyance and precognition and psychokinesis and all kinds of stuff. And I set out to find out whether it was all true. I was totally convinced, but then all the evidence that I collected suggested that there are no paranormal phenomena. And I carried on for about, nearly 20 years, really, doing research in parapsychology. But in the end, I just decided that there was no convincing evidence at all. I mean, it could still happen, but I don't think so. I doubt it. I don't expect it. And so I gave up. I also gave up because I got so upset with the way the media deal with paranormal claims, and in particular deal with claims of life after death. They tend always, particularly television, but other media can be as bad as well, they tend to set up a kind of false distinction between the good, nice, spiritual people who believe in all these paranormal phenomena and life after death and so on, and the nasty reductionist materialist scientists, that's me, who are unspiritual and don't care and are really nasty people. And that is so unfair. It just isn't true. But it is the way a lot of people think. And then they say, and you, the viewer, can make up your mind. Well, when you set up an unfair distinction like that, it's unfair to ask people to make up their mind on it. Sadly, that happens a lot. But in the end, I got so sick of it, I gave it up. But recently, I've sort of softened a bit and thought, well, I'm just about willing to talk about it again after all these years.
Yeah, I noticed that in your book as I'm reading it. Very good read, by the way.
Oh, thank you. You mean Seeing Myself?
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Okay. Hi, Susan. I'm Diego.
Oh, hello, Diego.
Hello. I have a question for you. Let's say from a popular viewpoint, we can assume, as you say, that probably the overwhelming majority of people misconceive a lot of things regarding the topic of out-of-body experiences, and especially also regarding what you exactly try to convey with your work and your book in this regard. So if a public audience asks you what you try to convey in regard of your research on out-of-body experience, how and what would you say and answer exactly?
I think what I most want to convey is that these are amazing and can be life-changing experiences. In my opinion, they are, I would say, spiritual experiences, but not because there's any spirit. I think the science that we have, and this is the whole thrust of my book, was to explain the science that we have, which really shows how we can account for the tunnels and lights and out-of-body experiences and the sensations of flying and floating and seeing one's own body, and all of this can be explained now, at last, from modern neuroscience. That doesn't mean these experiences are unimportant. They are not, and they can be quite transformative, I think, because of the way they give you a different insight into nature itself, and they make you have a different view on what you are and who you are. And often can be life-enhancing. So it's that dual message, if you like, that I really want to get over.
Yeah, because I understand that you've had an out-of-body experience, and we can refer to them as OBs for now on for the show, a short version. So you've described your experience in many videos and in your book, Seeing Myself. So I've also had an out-of-body experience and other anomalous experience that have led me into spiritual New Age beliefs that I believed were true and I wanted to share with others. Such an experience is hard to forget, and it feels really real and detailed, plus how many existential questions it opens up, like you were saying, and how we identify with it. But being a skeptic, I can imagine how such an experience can clash with reality and with where science is now. So for any skeptics who have had an OBE or other anomalous experiences, do you have any advice on how to approach what could be such an life-altering experience?
Well, if it's just a minor thing for you, then just keep an open mind and try and accept that things don't always match up and you can't always understand everything. But if you really want to go into it, then I think you have to do more or less what I did. You have to make sure that you've written down what happened to you or kept any records that you can of it very, very carefully and start investigating. in my view of my own experience, I mean, this is the whole thrust of my book, Seeing Myself, really. I had this incredible experience all that time, and now I think we can explain it. It's been a terribly long road. I wouldn't recommend it to everybody, but I'd recommend it to anyone who really feels hard about that clash between the scientific view and, ideas of souls or spirits or other worlds or life after death. Yeah, they clash. I mean, they just can't be true if everything else that we think, that we know in science is true. So have a go at finding out. Now, for me, the wonders of modern neuroscience and the discoveries we've made about where and how in the brain OBEs happen, about how our whole life's experiences come to shape them and so on, all this has led me to have to change my mind. I changed my mind about the paranormal, about telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis and precognition, way back because of all the evidence that I investigated back in the 1980s and 90s. Mm-hmm. But in terms of body experience, I really couldn't feel that I had any answers until recently. And right. Most important among those, I think, is the our brain constructs the sense of self, the sense of owning our body, the sense of location, of where we are, of embodiment, of having a point of view. All these things are constructed in different parts of the brain, and they show you that the self is not. There isn't actually a me in there who is conscious and has free will. There's a brain constructing stories about itself. Now, if you accept that, then out-of-body experiences are not something, or self leaving your body. It couldn't be. There's no such thing to leave, and that's why death is the end. So that's the view that all the research leads me to, and it might lead other people to a different direction. But I would recommend such a person, if they really want to understand it, delve into all that research. Be critical. If you're talking about the skeptic, then be critical about what you read about extendedness and consciousness beyond the brain and non-local consciousness and all these claims there are. To my mind, they end up in a dead end. When people claim, oh, wow, there's extended mind and all that. Well, okay, what is it? How does it work? What are its limitations? What are its variables? Go and try and find out. They can't answer those questions. But the science that brain constructs the self does answer questions. And that's why that journey can be very fulfilling, even though it means giving up all your favorite beliefs about yourself and the world.
Yeah, we have to ask ourselves, are we really leaving our body, or are we just still experiencing this from inside our mind?
You put that just in. That's what people always do, just experiencing it from in our mind, as though somehow really going beyond your body is kind of so much. Well, it would be if it were true. I mean, if there were something that could leave the body and go and see something at a distance, wow, wouldn't that be amazing? I mean, that would be, Nobel Prize worthy discovery. That would be transformative of everything we understand so far about the physical world. I mean, our understanding of the mind is so limited compared to other sciences, but it's getting somewhere. But it would be so science-shattering if it were true. Mm-hmm. I don't think it is, but I'm glad there are people, investigating it, because we don't find out unless we investigate it.
Like a built-in GPS.
We're not there yet. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say unfortunately or not, or fortunately. Let me ask you something else. Let's go into the concept of consciousness. Scientifically speaking, we know very little about consciousness. We know that brains have consciousness. And nevertheless, today, the concept of consciousness is highly misconceived, especially considering like internet biased communication and social media.
Can I stop you there?
Yes,
because you said we know that brains have consciousness. I completely disagree. That is a common belief, but from a philosophical point of view, it's doing what is called the mereological fallacy, which means attributing something to the wrong level of explanation. So, it's people who claim to be conscious, yeah. But the idea that brains have consciousness has two mistakes. One, it's not just brains, because a brain on its own is nothing. It needs a body and an environment and all sorts. But also, if you say something has consciousness, that's implying that consciousness is somehow separate from the brain. And that's very much the issue of the science of consciousness at the moment. I would say the whole science of consciousness is divided into two camps. The much larger camp is there is this thing called consciousness, and we've got to find it, and we've got to look for the neural correlates of it, and we've got to look for how it emerges or arises or is created words like that. In other words, consciousness is something in addition to everything that the brain and body are doing. The other camp, the smaller one, but to which I belong, along with Dan Dennett and Pat Churchland and many other people, or roughly people who are now called the illusionists, is to say that that's all wrong. Consciousness is not an added extra. It's not something, some mysterious thing that sort of emerges from the brain. It's just intrinsic to the kind of organism we are. So any organism which is capable of seeing and thinking and constructing a separation, a false separation, a dualist separation between me inside here and a world out there, any organism, or indeed machine, that constructed such a false dualist view would believe that there was this extra thing called consciousness. So that is my view, and that's why I jumped in and rejected your claim that we know that brains have consciousness. No, we don't know that.
What I wanted to say is, I was trying to highlight how there are so many speakers, New Age speakers in particular, such as Deepak Chopra and many others, who claim that even atoms have a consciousness, which is absolutely wrong. Or who claims that even a stone or the universe has some sort of consciousness. So I was trying to create a distinction between these kind of claims, which are, by the way, spreading and around, especially social media activity creates this kind of like what they call virtual memeplexes, which are collecting more and more people that are more prone to critically believe in absurd claims, such as Deepak Chopra, for example. And there are many fake informations and anti-scientific thinking, which is increasing dramatically. So what I wanted to ask you, what can be done to prevent unsound, acritical beliefs about out-of-body experiences, for instance, and consciousness itself from spreading unquestioned?
Well, that's about 20 questions all mixed up, isn't it? Let me say something first about Deepak Chopra. The views you've described there are roughly called panpsychism, which comes in many forms. The simplest form, the most sort of obvious form of panpsychism is that everything, including atoms, is conscious, or indeed has consciousness sort of attached, which is a silly idea. But variants on panpsychism do have something going for them. See, the problem is we can't find this kind of extra special thing called consciousness. We can't pin it down and so on. Well, what if it's in some sense intrinsic to the universe? I have a lot of sympathy with this sort of idea. Now, the trouble with Deepak Chopra's view, and many others that follow along from it, is he's saying more than that. He's saying something that consciousness comes first and then matter comes later. So he's still having some kind of duality there. And it seems to me that dualism has to be false. The idea that mind and body are completely separate things, that there are kind of, mental things and experience and consciousness, subjective exists, and that's a completely separate realm from the physical world. There are many attempts to relate them, and including attempts to solve the hard problem, which is a version of the mind-body problem. And Deepak Chopra thinks he's solved it by saying that consciousness comes first, and he really hasn't. He's a kind of idealist, really, which has all the same problems as materialism. Idealism says, let's put consciousness first. Well, how on earth do you explain matter? Materialism says, let's put material first. How do you explain consciousness? Which is why I call myself a neutral monist. I'm pretty sure that dualism is false. I've had plenty of mystical experiences and other experiences of non-duality in which the dualism disappears. But then when I come back to a scientific thinking, I can't work out how that can be so. So that's a few comments on panpsychism. I think the main thrust of your question was to do with how can we, in a world with all these social media, help people to understand things in a more scientific way. It's terribly hard. My book is absolutely an attempt to do that. It's an attempt to say, look, you can have a spiritual path. You can have experiences of non-duality or oneness with the universe. You can have many of those things while still understanding that it's all one, that there isn't some separate mind that goes floating off and so on. But, only a few people will read the book compared to the millions who will send to each other supposed evidence of somebody near death, floating into another room and seeing what's going on there, or going to heaven and reporting what it's like. These books, I read so many of them when I was writing my book on OBEs. These, I've been to heaven and came back, I saw heaven, all these kinds of books, Heaven is for Real. And they're just so awful, describing these impossible daft heavens and driving me up the wall. But they're terribly popular. I don't think we can change the fact that most people would very much rather believe that their self is a permanent, existing entity that will go on beyond their own death. Now, this is, of course, exactly what the Buddha was fighting against more than 2,000 years ago, in a totally different context, but in a world in which still people wanted to believe in life after death. And his whole teaching was about the fact that the self, like everything else, is impermanent and keeps changing all the time. And that is compatible with what I'm saying, and just highlights the fact that one can have a spiritual life while utterly rejecting all these popular ideas of life after death, souls, spirits, astral bodies, and all of that. But I don't have an answer to how we can make a more skeptical, more inquiring, more interested view prevail. It's terribly, terribly hard for science to fight against what people want to be true, for what is true to fight against what people want to be true.
Okay, so let me ask you something else in this regard. As you know, as you say, the rational thinking and fallacious assumptions and faith in general definitely have more power than reason and over-reason, critical thinking and logic. The totality, the complexity of the matter of spirituality is a powerful meme and generates a lot of faith and hope in people's mind. What kind of obstacles you are facing when you talk with people, and what are you doing to prevent or to deal with these obstacles?
The first one is the vividness of people's experience. Anyone who's actually had an out-of-body experience almost certainly will have found it one of the most vivid, bright, wonderful, clear experiences they've ever had. Now, in my opinion, that's because of what's happening in the brain. You haven't got the cloudy input through your eyes and everything. You've just got the higher parts of the visual cortex producing these images, which are therefore much, much clearer. And you haven't got a lot of other stuff going on that gets in the way as well. But never mind that. The point is that when you've had such a vivid experience, it's convincing to you that you left your body. If you are the sort of person who believes in the you of the self as being a continuing entity that lives inside your body and so on. So that vividness of experience is one of the obstacles. It's taken me decades to understand or begin to understand how that experience of mine could have been so utterly vivid and realistic when it was constructed by a whole lot of stuff going on in a somewhat disturbed brain. So that's one obstacle. I think the next we've already spoken about, which is that people really want the self to be what it isn't. And this is, again, what the Buddha pointed out, and why he said, for example, when he was asked, are there any cases where people lament and cry when they find out that there is no self? And he said, yes, when people understand that the self is impermanent, they cry and beat their chest and whatever. I mean, it was the same 2,500 years ago. So I think that's the second obstacle. It's the longing people have for the self to be real, solid, permanently existing. And the third obstacle is just, it takes a lot of evidence and scientific understanding to turn around our very natural views of the world. Now, we know that little kids start very early on, age sort of 3 to 4, beginning to make a separation between living things and non-living things, and have an idea about, you could almost call it a life force, something that makes things live, and between mind and matter. These distinctions arise quite early, and they're very natural. They may be useful to us in some way, although that's a big question that I'm working on, how useful they are. So in order to overthrow that sort of view, one can do that through personal experience, through decades, or maybe quicker for some people, of meditation and mindfulness. That can transform one's view of self, and then it's very, very much easier to overthrow those ideas. Or it can be through scientific investigation, and that means learning a lot of science and being critical of the experiments and trying to work out which ones really tell us what's going on and which don't. Those are the three main obstacles that I think I meet, and they're different in different people, and it requires different kinds of approach to help people to think more clearly about it.
Very good. In your book, Seeing Myself, you share honestly how you were wrestling with what to make of your OB experience. I can imagine it's made you feel torn between your skeptical scientific side and the side that wishes to explore things that many people would consider irrational or even delusional. I would think you must get annoyed working with academics and scientists. You said even at times like that they can tend to be too close-minded to these experiences, while also being annoyed with the people who are too open to these ideas and are gullible to these experiences. So how do you handle being pulled by these two sides?
So it's a very good description. I don't think it bothers me now anything like it used to.
Wow.
I mean, though most scientists will not take any interest in these things, and I do occasionally meet some very, very close-minded ones, including people who call themselves skeptics, who ought to be more curious and more open-minded, but often they're not. Mm-hmm. And then I do get really annoyed. I met someone at a conference recently who just said, "Oh, well, the consciousness, there's no problem about that, and it's all scientists, there's no problem." And those experiences, and that is irritating. But then there are always irritating people. I think what's happened in all these decades that I've been involved in this is that scientists at last, at least some, are coming round to thinking, because we have some kind of a grasp on, for example, how the brain constructs the notions of self and so on, suddenly realizing that out-of-body experiences are data. They're something that can really help us to understand our minds better. So there are quite a lot of scientific articles now, all of which I've talked about in my book, yes, where serious philosophers and scientists are taking on out-of-body experiences as sort of case studies that can help us to understand something about the nature of self. So I'm very, very encouraged. But going back to the sort of earlier times and thinking about your question, for me, the big struggle was in the first sort of 10 years or so, when the vividness of my own experience seemed to conflict with what understanding I had of how the brain works or what the mind is or so on. And it was very, very hard then to know what to do with it. And I guess I did what you have to do in science. I had to sort of hold conflicting ideas in my mind, read what I could, study what I could. And I got very frustrated, which is why, we mentioned right at the start of this interview, that I gave up parapsychology. I couldn't resolve things. And that is why I'm now so much happier, and why I've written this book, the more recent book, because that I do feel there's now some resolution. The science has moved forward far enough that we can actually make sense of the experiences. And if some very close-minded scientists come along and say, "Oh, I don't know why you're bothering with that," well, I'll give them an answer. I'll say I'm bothering with that. Because something like 15% of the population have had these experiences. We can't just wipe them away and say they don't exist. And secondly, because actually, if you go and read some of the science, you'll find that OBEs are becoming useful in our science of psychology and neuroscience. Mm-hmm. So I think things are a lot better now, a lot better than they were.
So you weren't struggling with being torn between, am I, the skeptic scientist mind or the spiritualist, trying to decide what side you fit into, and that wasn't so much.
Well, you put that as two sides.
Yes.
And what for me is they are not two sides. I think I pointed out earlier with my criticisms of the media that they turn them into two sides. And this happens a lot. I used to see it as two separate sides, but now I don't. It's gone on.
Okay.
This dichotomy is that on the one side are the people who believe in New Age stuff and astral projection and OBEs being something leaving the body and a life after death and all of that. And they are kind of categorized as the good, spiritual, nice, kind, lovely people. And on the other side, the materialist, reductionist scientists who don't believe in spirits and souls and blah, 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 who are horrible and non-spiritual. But there are now lots and lots of scientists, particularly in the field of consciousness studies, but elsewhere as well, are scientists who meditate, lifelong meditators, many of them, like myself, who are both. You can't categorize them as one or the other. They are people who have spiritual practice. Maybe they meditate every day, go on retreats, and consider that a spiritual path that has no connotations of astral bodies or souls or spirits or anything like that. In fact, there's large movements going on called spiritual naturalism or just naturalism or secular spiritualism or secular spirituality. These are all movements which are involving people who are saying, look, I can have a spiritual life. I can learn to understand myself. I can become a better person. I can become more compassionate. I can become less obsessed with my false self, let go of the false self. And that is helped by the modern neuroscience that we have. So now I don't think that there need to be that dichotomy. Yeah, it's all out there in the social media and in all the things that go around, I know, but you can't just wipe away a very natural way that people think, but we can work on it. And I think that the dichotomy it's rubbish.
That's great. I think that'll help a lot of people.
This reminds me, Sam Harris is trying to secularize spirituality, but let's talk about a little bit the concept of spirituality, because personally to me it's a little bit confusing, and I believe that is confusing to probably most people, aside the new age people that are completely twisting this. I remember I was talking with, long ago, I was talking with a neurologist, and he was claiming that spiritual experiences actually do exist, but when I try to approach this person and trying to ask, maybe those experiences are just high emotional experiences, they're not necessarily spiritual experiences, so maybe you're using this memetic label to amplify the value of what is just like a very powerful emotional experience or cognitive event.
There's that word "just" again, which Jessica used earlier, as though to dismiss the experiences. Just a very powerful emotional experience. Hang on a minute. A very powerful emotional experience is one of the most powerful things we can have in life. So why go, oh, just that? Because people have this longing for something more beyond.
Yes.
But I think the central problem is the word spiritual. And a long time ago, I and many others tried to kind of come up with words that would do for something like what we mean by spiritual experiences, but without believing in spirits. And people have used the word mystical, but that also in popular parlance means sort of confusing or magical or something like that. There is no perfect word to describe spirituality without spirits. But that's what I'm talking about, and I'm not alone, I'm glad to say.
I'm Robert M. Price, author of Deconstructing Jesus and the Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. This is WBAI, Peace and Justice Radio, and you're listening to Equal Time for Free Thought.
You're tuned to WBAI, New York 99.5 on your FM dial, streaming live at WBAI.org. I'm Jessica Schaub, and I'm joined today by Diego Fontanive, and you have been listening to a discussion with Susan Blackmore. And now, back to the interview.
If an audience asks you, how will you define the concept of spirituality? I'm not saying from a philosophical perspective, but from let's say a more scientific perspective. What will you say?
About spirituality?
Yes.
How you define it?
I don't think I could define it, but I would say it is something to do with loosening up the sense of self. The ordinary way that human beings go about our lives is to imagine that we are a self inside, that self is terribly important and has to be protected, that we are separate beings from the rest of the universe and from everybody else and every animal around us. But a spiritual experience and a spiritual practice and a spiritual life tends to dismantle all of that. It weakens the sense of a permanent, powerful self. It allows one more to surrender to the universe, to accept what's happening, to go along with things, and by not being so obsessed with self, to become more interested and helpful to other people. It's not a definition, but that's a sort of rough idea of the kinds of things that people describe in many, many different cultures and ages that happens through either spontaneous spiritual or mystical or religious experiences, through long practice of meditation and other disciplines. Okay, that's about closest I can get to saying what I mean by it. And that's why it's so difficult to talk about it. But there are lots of people trying, scientists and philosophers and other people as well. And that's all wonderfully encouraging to me.
When we talk about spirituality in these terms, then we have to talk about the self. And I believe that when we have to talk about the self, we have to be very careful to not really to define, but to describe what we mean by self. And as a matter of fact, our self or the me or the I or whatever way we like to call it is the result of what we accumulated, cognitively speaking, and that accumulation has a lot of biases and conditioning and influences. So usually we are not touching that point. I've seen these I will call it error, a lot in ancient Asian, especially Asian philosophies. There is not really quite a critical approach about the fact, which is a fact that our so-called self is actually conditioned by many factors. What we have been told, the place where we grew up, and the kind of childhood we had, the Memeplexes where we grew up, and many other things. So I think that the concept of the self is quite tricky and inevitably connected with the concept of spirituality, yes. But I think that, and also I wanted to ask you, it could be quite risky to avoid a critical inquiry about what we mean by self or the me or the I. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear. Are we on the same page about this? That the fact that the self, ourself, is cognitively, psychologically conditioned by plenty of factors. For instance, a person that says, I'm a Christian, but there is no such a thing as a Christian person, is a person who was born in a Memeplex that relies and clings to a specific religion we know as Christianity and Islam and so on.
This is a point Richard Dawkins makes. He said we should never ever speak of a Christian child or a Muslim child. They are children, had Memeplexes imposed on them, and I completely agree about that.
Right.
And I think that the major religions, most of them, the monotheistic religions, very unpleasant Memeplexes that are a burden to people who are brought up in them. Of course, they do have their positive sides as well, and that's why they keep going. But they have horrible consequences, as we see around us in the world today. But you said earlier on in what you were just saying then about Eastern religions, and of course there's a massive gulf between the monotheistic religions and Hinduism and so on, and Buddhism. Yes, there are branches of Buddhism which believe in and promote the idea of reincarnation as a reincarnation of a self into another life, but that seems to me not to fit at all with the early teachings of the Buddha, and certainly not his insight into no self. No self is anatta is a very confusing term, because he, as far as I can tell, he wasn't saying there's no self, he was saying the self isn't what you think. I think that sort of view, which is prevalent in Zen and Chan, which is the tradition in which I've been trained. I'm not a Buddhist, by the way, but I've been training in Chan, the Chinese precursor to Zen, for 35 years or so. That fits pretty well with the way that our scientific and philosophical understanding of self is going now. That it is, as you said, it's all causes and conditions, that said. Yeah. And those causes and conditions include all those Memeplexes that you get lumped on you. Not just the religion of your parents, but everything you learn at school and the culture that you grow up in and all the memories and so on. So all those are information that's stored in our heads and in our social world and in our lives, that makes up who we are. But the illusion is that in the midst of all that, there is this kind of nugget of me. And I've talked to so many students when I was teaching consciousness courses and so on, and I'll find them say, yes, but I mean me, you know, me. And I'm going, no, I don't know. Tell me about this me. And so I agree with you very much about the way selves are constructed through our lives. But it is quite possible, I think, to know that, understand that, to know that me sitting here, this body sitting here, talking to you, is a gene machine, a me machine. It has lived the life it has. It's been infected with the language that I'm speaking now, English, and some other languages, bits and pieces of, and all the science and other things that I know. But there's no me in the middle. There's no thing to which all those things cling. They cling only in the sense of being part of the physical and social world. That transition from believing in a persisting self that is having experiences and wielding free will and making decisions and so on, once a person, a body, a whole thing like this lets go of that central thing, all those other things that you described can stay, but the experience is totally different. And that, I think, is what I would call a spiritual transformation, because I don't have a better word for it.
Let me ask you something a little bit strange and a little bit out of topic. Do you think that artificial intelligence will somehow help us with the understanding of consciousness in the probably soon future?
Oh, Oh, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I've often been asked similar questions, but not quite in that way. Will it help us with the understanding of consciousness? Oh, there are lots of ways that it might. For example, if we set about creating artificial intelligence by mimicking the biological evolution of intelligence and of consciousness, that might help us that way. That's pretty difficult because we have no way of knowing whether something is conscious. I mean, this is one of the amazingly weird things about studying consciousness, and one of the reasons that I take the hard line that I do on it. You ask whether this robot is conscious, there is no way of finding out. Whatever it says to you, well, you can't know, and you can't know whether anyone else's consciousness is anything like yours either. We have a fundamental problem here, which keeps it being mysterious. Another way that it might help us is if we, or the systems that we're creating give rise to really high-level artificial intelligence, it might explain it to us. I mean, it might, go, okay, given all the science that you've done and that we artificial intelligences have done, we can now give you the answer. 42, I think.
Fascinating.
The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yes, I got it.
And the final way that it might happen is the way that I'm taking, which is that I'm suggesting, I talked about this in my TED lecture, and I've written a bit about it, and I'll probably write some more. The idea that genes were the first replicator on this planet, giving rise to the evolutionary process that produced all of biology. Memes were the second replicator on our planet, giving rise to human minds, illusions of self, and so on. And that there is already a third replicator on this planet that we have inadvertently let loose by creating all the machines, the servers, the computers, the phones, and all of these things. And creating the cloud and the internet and all the information out there, which is distributed all around the planet, stored in all kinds of different things that are all interconnected. I think that artificial intelligence is arising in that system, and we may not be able to understand it or even see what it's doing. And that may be conscious. I mean, if I'm right about the nature of consciousness, then it will be. And maybe that could give rise to us understanding it. But we would just be like mitochondria inside cells, or we will just be the little tiny creatures running about, not really understanding very much at all, serving all these machines by digging up the oil and producing, building the machines and whatever. So even if such things happen and become conscious, I'm not sure they'd help us understand it. But hey, these are interesting questions, and I can't really answer them.
Okay, well, the third replicator point is actually quite dangerous. We don't quite know what is going to happen, so we will see. But let's move to the next question.
Just say something about the danger there, because one of my arguments has been that it's always dangerous when a new replicator arises. So when genes arose, from on a dead planet, and creatures started producing oxygen, which was a poison then, and then the whole system had to adapt to it, and did adapt and got through that danger. That was one danger point. When memes arose, and I believe drove the big brain, that's a danger point, because there's all sorts of problems when you have to produce a bigger and bigger brain to produce all this stuff. And when you start copying things that are actually not good for you, then that's going to kill people. And, a lot of dangers would have arisen in the early stages of memes. And, maybe that's why other hominid species died off. We still don't know quite why we're the only hominin species that has survived on this planet. So, I mean, a lot of speculation there, but I'm just speculating. And then it's possible that the third replicator, memes, the technological memes, could be dangerous because of the way we are being changed by having phones and these obsessions, social media and so on. They're dramatically great and sucking up the planet's resources, which may contribute to global warming and climate change and various other dangers. And it could be dangerous. Why this might be important, apart from considerations of consciousness and of human life, is when you think about the fact that we have not heard from any other civilizations out there in the universe. Could it be that these switches of replicator are so dangerous that they actually kill off the creatures that have produced them in the first place? If that is so, then we would expect not to hear from other civilizations, and we would expect ours to go extinct Perhaps not in my lifetime because I'm quite old now, but perhaps in yours.
Thank you, so nice.
Let's hope I'm wrong, and you'll have a great life when I'm dead.
I just wanted to clarify with you. You caught a couple justs, and it wasn't meaning that I was necessarily discounting, and I was playing devil's advocate. I believe Diego was too. You know, this is an atheist skeptic show, but we're not rejecting every single unexplained anonymous experience as not true. I think perhaps it is true, but what my concern is, and Diego's concern, is that it tends to, people, when they identify with such beliefs and experiences, and they become lost to the highly emotional experiences, and I mean, even though they are very valid and they are wonderful, you know, when we lose ourselves to it, when we start thinking through it, this is what concerns me about it, managing our mind through this, because I've seen, you know, people become more gullible with these sort of beliefs, or even be exploited by people who read all about OBEs and can convince others that they've had them, but they really don't. And so I was just wondering, when we define our life by these things and ourself by these experiences, it can be something of a problem. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you see that as well, or?
Well, I jumped on when you said just, only to illustrate the problem that I've had in the past, which is probably not what you meant, but it gave me the opportunity to say, take this attitude, oh, if it's just in the brain, that's somehow not interesting. Or if it's just, you know, neurons firing, whatever, that's not interesting. It is interesting. It is. It's very interesting. So that was why I said that. But when it comes to profound emotional experiences, I think sometimes, I'm not sure about it, but I think sometimes when people have profound emotional experiences or profound transformational experiences, they don't know what to do with it, how to react. So they'll grasp at straws. They'll go and read all this ridiculous stuff, which may be the best thing they can find. And so it's kind of up to us to provide better things. But one thing I would say is, if you have a profound emotional experience, try to be present with it, or particularly if have repeated experiences. I mean, I get lots of emails from people who have lucid dreams, false awakenings, sleep paralysis, out-of-body experiences, tunnel experiences, all sorts of things which have deep emotional effects. I would say, if you have them, you know, often, try to be mindful, try to feel when the feelings come. Don't fight them, don't run away from them, don't go, wow, this is amazing, just stay with it, feel whether it goes, learn about your own reactions, learn about how it feels to be in the midst of that experience. That's the important part. It's a genuine experience that you're having. This is an experience now. Find out yourself by investigating it, rather than what I think is an easy tendency. I'm so excited and so, and you get kind of overwhelmed without staying present with it. Then all you can do is look back on it later and go, oh, that was incredible, I must find an amazing explanation, and you go off to all these websites that will tell you, this proves whatever.
Right. Yeah, I had this, it was very highly emotional, my out-of-body experience. I actually thought I was dead because I tried to grab something and my hand went right through it. And as soon as I had this high emotional experience, I got pulled back into my body. I didn't see the silver cord, but I felt it like tape measure sucking me back in extremely quickly.
So that was like the silver cord, was it? The tape measure. That's a brilliant example, a modern example of the silver cord.
I didn't see it, but I felt it. I knew there was something there that was connecting me, but I thought I was dead. I didn't know I was having out of body. I thought I was, I don't know what I thought. I knew something was weird because I was not walking. I was hovering down the stairs. But yeah, go ahead.
That's really interesting, because quite a lot of people, something like, the figures are difficult to get because surveys differ so much, something like 10% of people who have OBEs feel some sort of connection. Only about 4%, by my estimate, actually see some kind of connection, which is typically a silver cord. And it's very interesting to me why and who, but we really don't know the answers to that question. But what you described about your reaction is very typical. If you go, what's happening? Kind of almost panic, not quite, but a very strong reaction, then that ends it. That will end a lucid dream. Yep. It will end all those things. Yep. So the skill to practice being there with the experience, not to go, anything, just go, ooh, what's happening now? And just be there, not really thinking, just experiencing. That's a way to get more used to these experiences, and then to be able to incorporate them into your life and find out what they have to teach you. Because I think these spirits have a lot to teach you, and it's not that you are a spirit that's going to go on forever. It's a lot deeper, more interesting than that.
Very neat. So I was wondering what your link was between OBE, anomalous experiences, memes, and teens for you, and what made you to decide to transition from, I mean, we know that what made you leave parapsychology, but OBEs to memes is a very interesting change.
It certainly is. I mean, isn't life strange?
I relate to you so much. We're so similar.
I suppose I've always been interested in all kinds of things, and I have, as life has gone along, been more and more willing to go with what comes to me. So, of course, I was obsessed with out-of-body experiences and then parapsychology because of my own experience, and then got sick of it and so on, and began to think, well, the underlying question there really is not about what goes out of the body, because nothing does. It's about the nature of consciousness. So I got deeply involved in that and went to the wonderful Tucson conferences and so on, and wrote my textbook on consciousness and other books on consciousness. And then in the mid-1990s, because I was being a workaholic, I got 2 young kids, I was traveling too much and holding down a full-time job, and everything was all too much, I got chronic fatigue. And I got post-viral fatigue. I had flu, and I got very ill, went to bed, and just couldn't get up. My legs just didn't work, and I was in bed I was almost completely in bed for about 6 months, and then kind of gradually getting up for another 6 months. During that time, I certainly couldn't type or do anything like that. I could read a bit. I could read for maybe 10-15 minutes at a time, and I chose to read Darwin's Dangerous Idea by Dan Dennett, which took me back into memes, and I reread The Selfish Gene, where the idea of memes originated. And, you know, it was a complete change from everything I'd ever done before. But I conceived this idea by the time I was well again, after a year or so, when I could begin to actually sit up and type at the computer, I had in my mind the entire book, which is why I read The Meme Machine. So that was a weird reason for doing that, and it's gone on interesting me. And I've done lots of work on that. But then it was kind of maybe, well, in the last few years, really. It started in 2002 when Olaf Blanke, the neurosurgeon, discovered the spot in the brain that you can stimulate to produce out-of-body experiences. And that let the whole swathe of research. And that was why I finally thought I was never, ever going to go back to out-of-body experiences. But hey, now there's wonderful science, I will. So, yeah, you're right. These are completely different strands of my intellectual interest. But, you know, I'm interested in all sorts of things. And I have the joy and privilege of living in a society which allows me to sit at home and write books and just about make enough money to live that way, and I really appreciate that ability to do all these different things and to ask questions that, you know, we really don't know the answers to, and I don't know the answers to, and that's what's exciting about being a scientist.
That was such an exciting chapter, and I really want to ask you about that, but Diego has one more question for you, and then...
Yeah, like another maybe a little bit strange question.
She loves them. Secretly, she loves them.
It's not really that strange. I mean, regarding memes, spiritual memes can be actually quite dangerous. I mean, that our history, if we think historically for a little while, is filled with plenty of examples regarding the dangerousness of spiritual faith-based memeplexes. So the question is there a way to keep the study of out-of-body experience somehow separated from this common popular idea of spirituality, the memeplex of spirituality or faith, and somehow strictly intertwined with science and reason, or it is somehow inevitable to avoid this kind of mixture, this fusion between the scientific study of out-of-body experiences and mystical ideologies?
I think I want to take issue with your idea about science and reason. And in fact, I've taken issue with this before. I've argued with Paul Kurtz and various other people and refused to sign up to things that go on about reason and rationality and so on. Reason and rationality are not the only way to understand things. Much more important to my mind is the scientific method, and that can also include, if you expand it, the general idea of curiosity, of thinking, of skepticism. And that does not necessarily mean just being scientific. So I would think the way that these things can be put together, rather than there being a great gulf between them, is to take the questioning attitude. Now, I know I've mentioned Buddhism a few times because this is a good example, at least Zen in particular is a good example, of the questioning attitude applied in your own life. So I would encourage people to, when they have strange experiences, to explore those experiences with a critical mind. It doesn't have to be rational and reason. That's one strand. That's an important strand, but it's not the only one. Mm-hmm. If you have regular strange experiences, whatever they might be, learn about them. I mean, I meditate every day. I go on retreats, and I've had many experiences of being bewildered by something and just sitting there. I've worked a lot with koans, those strange questions you get in Zen, you know, who am I? Or what is this? Or when is this? That's a very difficult koan. And investigating these things it's a similar attitude to a scientist investigating a difficult question, or a philosopher struggling with a difficult problem. It's an attitude of, oh, what is this? Let me look further. Let me try and see. Let me try and see more clearly. Now, you can take that attitude, I would say, in a philosophical way, in a scientific, rational reasoning way, and in a personal experience way. And I would encourage people to have that kind of open-minded, questioning, querying, inquisitive view in all of those realms, and not to put science and reason against all the rest.
All right, I know we're almost out of time. I just wanted to ask you, when you discovered the part of the brain that can immediately trigger an out-of-body experience, were you tempted to try that out on yourself? Because as far as we know, you only had that one major out-of-body experience a while ago. So are you just interested in understanding why we have them or how they work?
Oh, of course. But, that discovery was in a severely ill epileptic patient who had subdural electrodes all over her brain. Right. That means electrodes under the skull, not only under the skull, under the dura, the membrane around the outside of the brain. No way would anyone have that done to them unless they were so ill that it was a last resort. So that's not possible. But I have had similar experiences with magnetic stimulation across the temporal lobes, and I've had very weird experiences with that. I've tried all kinds of drugs. And the only drug that is really supposed to reliably produce out-of-body experiences is ketamine. Mm-hmm. And the experiences that produces for me are not like the vividness and wonderfulness of the experience I first had. I've tried all the techniques, I don't know about all, but the popular techniques, the rope method and Muldoon and Carrington's method and Munro's methods, and yes, and I have had brief out-of-body experiences, but nothing like that original one. But one of the things that I explain in the book is how, when I started delving into what we know, I discovered that there were probably many things that contributed to the state of my brain and body at the time, and that would be a lot of hyperactivity in visual cortex and temporal lobe and so on. Know which bits of the brain you would need to have that hyperactivity. This, in the end, is what it comes down to, is a brain that is randomly firing and pulling up all kinds of strange stuff depending on the structure of that part of the brain. And I think that's the final way that makes me feel I can understand what went on. But of course, if anyone came up with a magic method for producing another experience like that, of course I would. Yes, please. If you come up with it, let me know.
Sonia. Yeah, okay. All right, so we'll let you go now. I just wanted to ask you, what was next for you? Do you have any other new projects that you're working on?
No. I've spent the last 2 years or more writing 3 books at once. I'm absolutely exhausted. I've promised my husband that I won't start another book this year, and although I've got lots and lots of ideas, I am determined to spend more time in the garden, more time with my granddaughter, and tidy up my study and generally recover from doing too much work.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you again so much, and take care.
Thank you so much.
Not at all. That was a pleasure. Thank you.